welcome back to Paul.caunce on construction. Today's guest, Tim Jones, is a senior lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. We're going to be talking about modern methods of construction. Let's see what Tim has to say. So, Tim, thanks for agreeing to be interviewed today on modern methods of construction. But before we get into the meat of that, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, so I'm Tim Jones. I'm currently a principal lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. I've worked at Sheffield Hallam University for the past 14 years. I describe myself as a career construction professional with over 35 years industry experience. I started my career working for two of the largest privately owned family businesses in the construction industry, Shepherd Construction and Waits Construction, as a site manager, project manager. I then spent about 10 years working in the leisure sector, notably for Mitchells and Butlers PLC and for the Gala Coral Group as a project manager, doing sort of multiple developments around the UK. About 14 years ago, I got an opportunity to give a bit back and went into academia, and I've been there ever since.
Okay, thanks. That's a nice, concise response, and you've been in the industry even longer than me. So I found someone anyway. So thinking about modern methods, I often think of off-site construction, and I think of driving down the A1 with wide load and something that looks like an overgrown porter cabin on the back of a flatbed truck. Is that what this is all about, or is there more to it?
I think it's quite an interesting question, that, Paul. And one of the I've taught modern methods of construction for most of my academic career, and interestingly, I'd never heard the terminology used in industry until I joined academia. So I thought it was a term that had been invented by academia. And as I've kind of got into it more and more in my teaching career and done the sort of background research, it's a bit of a myth, and it's a bit of a stupid title, because modern methods of construction suggests something new. Well, we've been building modular and kit homes and buildings since the 19th century. So none of what we class today as modern methods of construction is really new. Although, and you describe this back of a lorry kind of thing. Well, there are various different types of MMC. So there are volumetric units, which is the typical kind of porter cabin type unit that you would see on the back of a lorry. But you can also have panelized construction, where you basically get walls, floors, and other components, and then you can get buildings that are built out of much smaller sort of kit of parts. But so I would generally sort of describe modern methods of construction. We use too many terms. We use modern methods of construction. We use off-site manufacture, and we also use prefabrication. And now lots of people don't like using the word prefabrication because of the stigma that comes with it from past failures, if you like. So as I say, modern methods is a bit of a misleading term, to be honest.
I did think about that, and in my office boardroom, I have a collection of covers from Fortune magazine that are all construction related as a display. One of them is from 1949, and it's a precast concrete panel being swung into place using a crane, while two construction managers are watching it being swung in. So there's, as you said, we've been doing it for certainly many decades. So what is new about it? What are the benefits to us for using these methods, the off-site methods, rather than traditional site building and construction?
Okay, so if I was to give you, the sort of textbook response, if you like, and often the response that comes back from the manufacturers, what people say about MMC are things like, we've got an improvement in cost certainty.
Yeah.
We've got improvements in delivery times. We've got improvements in health and safety because we're making much of the stuff in a factory, and therefore we're reducing the amount of on-site operations. We reduce the reliance or the impact of weather on the construction because we're building in a factory, and therefore because we've got less time on site. And if we time our operations at the right time of year, we can minimize the effects of weather.
Yeah.
we talk about quality because things are made in a factory, and therefore we should be able to improve the levels of quality. And they're the sort of key things that people sort of espouse as. The final one is we say cheaper. Generally, there are people who will say that these things are cheaper. And I think for every one of those things that you put forward as an argument, as a benefit of modern methods, you can counter each one of those benefits with an argument against it. So, for example, if you say, well, we're improving the time on site because we're manufacturing in a factory,
Yeah.
people then think, well, okay, so does that impact the program of construction in total? Well, yes, it does, because you've got to order it earlier, and actually you're still spending time in the factory building it. So the construction project time is probably the same. It's just that a lot of it is done in lead time in a factory. So we're not necessarily shortening the duration overall. The impact of weather is another one. So often when we use modern methods, we bring to site finished products, completed units with all the finishes. Well, yeah, which is all well and good that we're doing that in a factory, but if we bring it to site in the middle of winter and it's chucking it down all the time, then we've got to think about temporary protection. And actually bringing those finished products onto site creates a problem in itself, because we've got to protect it from the elements. And if we do get damage, then we're into remedial works. Do you know what I mean? So there's all sorts of different factors that come into play. Qualities are, some of the sort of things that are good about MMC. If you're using modular volumetric units that are completely finished in the factory, you can tick the box and say, yeah, it's met all the quality criteria, and we're delivering it to site. We don't have to open it until just before we hand over. But I've had experience of doing these things on site where you open it up the day before you're due to hand over because you don't want anybody in there damaging it. And actually, it's got damaged in transit because it's made out of a lightweight steel framework, and we didn't think about the number of times you're going to have to pick it up and crane it and move it around. So, as I say, every time you come forward with an advantage, I can give you a counter argument that says that's a disadvantage.
Interesting, because when I thought about those advantages that are all over construction media, they seem to tick all the boxes, going right back to Latham, Egan, Farmer's review of the labour model. It proposes really to take large strides towards meeting Construction 2025 initiatives of reducing schedule and reducing costs. So aside from that, are there any other drawbacks to it? I mean, there's certainly the potential, and I think, with appropriate protection and lifting techniques, perhaps we could overcome those quality questions. But what about more broadly? What about its impact on the industry? Are there any impacts there?
I think, yeah. I mean, when I've been, as I said to you, I've been teaching this stuff for a long time, and I try to get into kind of lively debates with my students, some of whom were part-time students and who are working in the industry. One of the arguments that always comes out and gets spat back at you to a degree is, if you're de-skilling this process and you're putting it into a factory and we're using semi-skilled labour, what does that do to an already depleted workforce in construction? In other words, we're all saying there's a skills crisis, and it's okay to say, well, we can help the situation by de-skilling the process, but there's always going to be a need for those skilled tradespeople on the normal projects where we're not using MMC. And I don't think MMC is capable of replacing everything. So there's a kind of counter argument that says, well, you're actually replacing skilled labour on site with semi-skilled labour in a factory, and what you're doing is you're making the already skilled labour pool be less and less available, in a sense, because nobody's going to want to come into an industry that's not sustainable because there's no work for them. And I think that kind of exacerbates the problem. I think the other thing that worries me, Paul, about MMC is the sort of, we're old enough to remember or have grown up in a generation where we could see the outcomes of the previous failures. And interestingly, one of the things that we talk about is quality of construction in a factory. And yet, things like the Ronan Point disaster, some of the sort of the failures in the Wimpy No Fines prefabricated buildings and those kind of buildings were actually as a result of poor quality control. So we put in place a factory production system, and when we come to either assemble it on site, we don't assemble it properly. And I think that was one of the key reasons why the Ronan Point disaster occurred, is that the connections between the flat precast concrete units were not done with a degree of integrity. And so when there was an explosion, the building collapses. And similarly, if we don't put good practices in place in the factory, we could be bringing those problems to site at a later date. Now, I think we've got a lot better at the, building concrete units in factories, and so we can control that quality much better than we could back then. Having said that, one of my biggest concerns is that we build a different type of problem, because the R&D in development of some of the new modular techniques or the new versions of it, I'm kind of worried about things like mold growth in buildings, because we get super airtight buildings.
Yes.
And we don't adequately ventilate them. And I have some concerns about the way that modular units are plonked onto the foundations, and that junction between ground and building. And are we going to get some issues around rotting systems, etc., etc.? So I think that some of my concerns are around, has enough R&D and product testing being put into this before we bring it to a market on a mass scale? And are we just creating a different set of prefabs for 20 years down the line that we end up demolishing because they failed for other reasons? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. I also hear in the long list of proposed benefits of MMC, the improvements in sustainability. And while I can see there being some material wastage or savings in material wastage benefits, potentially some embedded carbon benefits depending where you're sourcing the material. When you look at the other aspects of a triple bottom line, the social consequences of having regional factories rather than dispersed construction, and the economic impact, as you mentioned, going to a semi-skilled workforce, presumably lower value, lower pay, potentially has a widening effect on the wealth gap that's already significant in this country, and taking a skilled construction worker who is probably earning above the average wage to a factory worker who's going to be earning below the average wage. And I think that's not to be taken lightly. Do you share any of those concerns?
Yeah, I do. I do share that concern. And like you say, what tends to happen is that factories are developed close to motorway junctions, where we've got good transportation links, and also where we've got pools of cheap labour, don't they?
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily. So if you take the typical construction workforce in the UK, there is, I've got enough experience in my career, having worked all over the country, to know that there are certain parts of the country where are good for labour, and they're usually the major cities, aren't they? So Leeds, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool. There's a pool of labour. That doesn't necessarily mean to say that, as you say, that the factories will grow near those locations. And then the other thing that people often forget about from a sustainability point of view is that there's proven research that there is a significant amount of energy used in construction is both transportation of materials to and from site,
yeah, and
the transportation of labour. But what the MMC bit doesn't sort of take account of is, well, if your factory's in John O'Groats and the construction site is in Plymouth, then you have an awful lot of transportation to get you from John O'Groats to Plymouth, haven't you? And so actually, are we just replacing that transportation problem from, and I know from my past when, we were building hotels using bathroom pods, and we were getting pods from Denmark, or we were getting pods from China or Italy or RB Farquhar's factory in Scotland. So yes, you are getting the benefit of lots of attributes from this particular stuff, but then you've got all this transportation. So the carbon footprint is a bit of a questionable one, I think, isn't it, in that respect?
Yeah, it's certainly a question I've had on my mind, and it's difficult to see without modelling it over time what the real impact is going to be. If people are watching this video and haven't been, haven't had previous experience of modern methods or offsite construction, modular, and wanted to find out some more about it, are there any resources that you're aware of through your teaching that people could access in order to become better informed on this subject?
Yeah, definitely, Paul. I mean, I, people often sort of think, academia, we should be looking at books. There are a number of very good technology books. I usually quote sort of Barry's Advanced Construction as one of the good books. There will be a chapter in that book, but it's only a small part of it. Now, what I tend to do when I sort of teach the students is the resources that I use. People like the NHBC have got some really, really good publications that basically tell you the whole history and story of modern methods of construction and go through all of the different types. So panelized,
Yeah.
volumetric, and all that kind of stuff. And they talk through the history of there's bits in there about Ronan Point and about the post-war houses that were built with all those factories that were developed. So
Yeah.
as a resource, I often direct my students at that particular thing because it kind of gives you a potted history, but it's written in a really sort of accessible way. So I think those kind of things. There's quite a lot of stuff being published now because MMC is seen as the thing. There's
Right.
quite a lot of publications coming out at government level. You mentioned the Farmer Review, the Principles of Latham and Egan, a good sort of starting place because we certainly do need to change the way that we do things. But I see MMC as only a partial solution, not as a replacement for what you and I would describe as traditional mainstream construction. I mean, there's some interesting things. I think what I've seen in my career change, Paul, is a part of MMC that we don't really talk about a lot. So if you go to most major construction sites building large commercial buildings now, they will be adopting techniques like, these days, pretty much concrete staircases are nearly always prefabricated.
Right.
We're using precast concrete lift cores and lift shafts and things like that. There are obvious benefits from a safety perspective in construction and for programs and things like that. So those kinds of products, most commercial buildings now that have an external envelope would have previously been built with a masonry skin. So they would have had in situ blockwork on the inner skin, masonry or cladding on the outer skin. Now we use all these SFS type products and things. So that's what I would describe as MMC. And the main contracting commercial building contractors, the big tier one contractors, are all really up to speed with that. This kind of volumetric, panelized construction type stuff is still fairly low key, often used for sort of budget hotels,
Yeah.
student accommodation, apartment buildings. There are some really sort of innovative things that have been done in the healthcare sector. So, things like operating theatres built in a factory. You can see the obvious benefits of cleanliness because you can keep everything clean. You're delivering effectively a completed operating theatre to a hospital, and there's loads of benefits like that. But the sort of, for me, it's a partial solution to an industry-wide problem.
So for those that are afraid of the future and afraid of change, this isn't the end of construction as we know it necessarily. It's just a shift in the way some of the components are being delivered by the sound of it.
I think so. I mean, I say this to my students often. I still believe very firmly that we're going to always be digging holes in the ground and filling them with concrete, or we might have a cement replacement in there somewhere,
Yeah.
but there's always going to be a need for digging holes and filling them with concrete. And I think we're always going to want to see people laying bricks. There's been lots and lots of reasonably hopeless failed attempts at bricklaying machines, haven't there? But we've never really properly replaced the proper skilled trade of a bricklayer. So, I think for anybody who's young and wants to get into the industry, I would still very much try and encourage people to pick up the tools and try and get a trade because we're gonna still need those people, and we need to think, as much as we want to think about modernizing and developing modern techniques. I think we need to invest as much energy and time in young people and directing the right kind of people to pick up the trowel or pick up the hammer and the saw and become tradespeople, because we're going to need them going forward.
Well, on that note, it's an interesting thought and probably a separate topic about the need to reinvest in trade skills. Tim, thank you very much for sharing your experience and expertise on this subject. And I hope that in the future we can get you back on to talk about some of the other topics that you regularly lecture on.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I look forward to seeing myself on YouTube.
So thanks for watching another Paul Caunce on Construction interview. Hopefully you enjoyed that discussion with Tim on modern methods. If you liked the video, please hit the like button below. As always, if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so that when I publish new videos, you'll get the notice. Thanks.